Hi, and welcome to Dead Air Live. My name is Rich Schieferdecker, and the topic of today's show is called Guantanamo on the Hudson, and we're referring specifically to the events of August 31st, 2004, Republican Convention. Remember that? We do. With me here is Mike Hall, who's a fellow producer with Somerville Producers Group.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike. And also Savich Rashovich. Did I pronounce that properly?
Perfectly.
Great, and he's here to offer some political commentary, as he was also involved in the demonstration that happened on Sunday in New York. That's correct?
That's correct.
And but what we're really here to start to talk with in the beginning is Mike's story. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened to you in New York?
Okay, I had arrived in New York on Saturday in order to document and to videotape the demonstrations outside of the Republican Convention. And my intention was to create a documentary film about those demonstrations with a personal angle, that is to show the personal reasons why people were out in the street on those days, to give a contrast to the general corporate media accounts of the demonstrations, which tended to show the events in a broad brush sense.
Right.
Showing the slogans and the signs, but not really showing the personal reasons why people were objecting to whatever their issues were.
I see. I know that the media coverage of the whole thing really just focused on the number of protesters who were there.
Absolutely.
So your attempt was to sort of be among them and
yes,
and get more.
I was part of a group called the Independent Media Center, which were a collection of individual producers and media organizations who were dedicated to the same type of thing that I was doing. And it was a small band of dedicated people who were out on the streets trying to get as much video as possible. And it's mostly centered in New York. And right now they're putting together a full-length feature about the demonstrations.
Okay. Now, we're also, I just neglected to mention at the start that we're also going to be joined later in the show by Charles Shaw, who's going to join us on the phone from Chicago. Charles was also in the demonstration that you were at, Mike, and suffered a similar fate to you. So what happened? What happened to you at the demonstration?
On August 31st, there were a number of civil disobedience actions that were planned, and I didn't know the exact time or location of these actions because they were kept fairly secret. But I was in Union Square that evening, and looking around I could tell that something was about to happen, that there were very heartfelt expressions of dissatisfaction amongst the crowd and passionate speeches. And I found a marching band that was getting ready to launch into the street, and they were setting up in Union Square, and I thought it was possible that they could be starting this whole business. So I kept my eye on them, and sure enough, they launched into the street in defiance of a police order that they get a permit before they march.
Right. Were the police making their presence known outside the
Absolutely.
square there?
They were within the square. They put a perimeter around the square. Their presence was well known. They had motor scooters, bicycles, and in fact paddy wagons and buses on the streets. But this was typical for the entire time I was in New York since Sunday, that the police were making their presence known, but just basically to contain the peace. And in fact, there was demonstrations the day before which were also not permitted, which the police allowed to pursue without confrontation. So I figured at the time that there would be no problems, that I could continue documenting this protest and not be apprehended by the police.
Right. And Savich, you were at the Sunday demonstrations, right? And that went off pretty peacefully, yes?
It did. Mike called me and said he's going, so I thought, I don't want to just go to a protest and participate as one of the whistling people. I wanted to do something, so I thought I could assist him, carry equipment, do extra camera shots, whatever it is. And Sunday was great because all these people, cops were nice. But I think if I were one of them, I would have planned that whole thing days in advance anyway. So I assumed that Sunday was nice because you don't want to abuse 500,000 people.
Right.
It would be a very bad move.
Right, a few too many enemies. So, but generally because of the Sunday protest, the mood was pretty good. That had gone off pretty well, right?
There had been a very small number of arrests on Sunday and Monday, maybe like 24 or more. And that trend, I think a lot of people on the street considered that to be what the police, the way the police were going to operate, that they would make examples of certain, perhaps more hardcore violent protesters or outspoken protesters, but that generally speaking, people who were there to show support would not necessarily be taken up. There are organizations that plan these protests, generally a small number of individuals, and they advertise for these events that they put on, hoping that the community will come in and participate and show their support for the issue.
Right.
And I think that was the case this time on August 31st, that many people were there without realizing exactly what the consequences might be.
Right. And in your case, the consequences
were arrest.
Right.
I was caught in a cordoned-off area on 16th Street off of Union Square. We'll be showing video of this, which I was fortunate enough to walk away with after my arrest. But I was detained for 43 hours. And my charges were disorderly conduct and parading without a permit, both of which I considered to be technically true, that I was in the street parading, if you could say that, with my camera, and that in the heat of the moment I may have added to some of the chanting. However, I think the video speaks for itself, and unless you want to talk some more, we could go ahead and start that.
Well, I just wanted to ask you before we got started, what primarily, I think is the line a little blurry between whether you were you there sort of as a protester, or were you there really as a documenter?
I say definitely that I was supporting the protesters, and that the point of my documentary, if I was pressed, would be to get the voices of the dissenting political views out into the open, because I considered the standard Republican issued sound bites to be well covered by the corporate media.
Sure.
And I thought it was very important to get the alternative points of view, which coincidentally I happen to agree with. So I was not timid about following them because I supported them. I thought that they were doing the right thing. But at the same time, I was running my camera, and I fully intended to create a documentary about this protest without being jailed. I mean, practically speaking, I was off the streets for 2 days, and those were 2 days which I could not collect video for my job, for my work.
Right.
So I was surprised at the result.
And that brings in a raft of questions, of course, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I think that we want to roll the video so that we can let people at home see what it is that we're talking about, since Mike's experience really is been documented so well.
Okay, we got. You can voice over without the box. We can talk. Yes, I want to. Yes, this part of the video shows the beginning of the parade. You can see that the marchers entered into the street that borders Union Square, Union Square East. And that's the point at which they had, performed their act of civil disobedience. And what you can see, there's nobody stopping them. As they go further down the street, you'll be able to see the police that are amassing towards 16th Street, which is, I believe, at the building you see with the large columns on it. When they get up to that point, you'll see police directing them onto 16th Street, which we would later learn for the purpose of sealing the street and performing these mass arrests. On this day, I should add, many other civil disobedience acts were being organized, and at the World Trade Center, at Herald Square, and at the New York Public Library, a large number of individuals were arrested simultaneously, in fact, 1,200 in all. For the entire course of the convention, something like 16 or 1,800 people had been arrested total. So on this one day, it's remarkable that so many arrests had occurred.
And that sort of was the story in the mainstream media, was that thousands of people had been arrested.
Right. It was remarkable, and for the most part, the offenses that were charged these many people were violations, which under normal circumstances would result in fines rather than imprisonment. And the fact that we, on the average, spent 2 days in prison, which is well beyond the 24-hour limits required by New York law. We can talk about the implications and the possible reasons why those long detentions occurred.
Sure. Right, because a lot of people contended that the reason that they were held that long was simply to keep them off the streets until the end of the convention.
Yes, that was the prevailing theory. Now you can see the police are directing the parade onto 16th Street. And by this time, people had caught on that a parade was happening. You see photographers all over the place, interested bystanders. I had later talked with others who had been arrested at this location and found out that many had just been walking on the street incidentally, that they were buying a gallon of milk for their family, or because they lived on the street, they were there and trapped.
Right.
So
everybody on the street got swept.
Absolutely, it was indiscriminate. There was, you can see later on how the police had actually moved in a tactical way, almost as if this were a military operation.
Were there even old elderly on the street and
Absolutely,
young children
yes.
and that
There
kind of
were
thing?
people in their teens, in their 70s, and I can't say how long those individuals were confined. I'd say for the most part, the 20, 30-ish, 40-ish people were the ones who were held the longest. Perhaps special accommodations were made for others.
That's so ageist.
So what's remarkable actually about this segment is that you don't see any police around. The police were at the end of the block, which this band will approach in a minute or two. And the police were at the beginning of the block where they were directed from Union Square. There was no purpose for them to be in this location because their tactic was to stop the parade and to trap the people on the street.
We are expecting, you're hearing the phone ring, it's because Charles Shaw is going to be joining us, and I'll see if this is him, but... Hello?
Hi, I'm looking for JoJo.
For JoJo. Is this Charles?
Yeah, it is.
All right, Charles, you're looking for us.
Oh, hey.
Great, glad you could join us. We're watching Mike's tape right now.
Excellent, excellent.
And and Mike's commenting on the tape. So if you just want to hang on the phone and we'll talk to you in just a bit.
Okay, great.
Okay, but you can hear him as he's talking about the tape.
So at this stage, the band has reached the end of the street, and there are several dozen protesters, maybe 50 in all, sitting on the street, locking their arms and chanting And this is clearly a group who intended to break the law for the purpose of this demonstration. You can see the photographers lining up like paparazzi
Right.
to get this event on film, and now you can see police officers who are motioning them away. This was a fairly decisive moment because it was the point at which the police line had been drawn. That is, the photographers who were covering the event were allowed to go, but now a line had been defined by the police, which from this point of view of the camera is behind our backs. And there was no passing through that barrier. It's kind of difficult to see the details of this, but in the distance you can make out the motorcycles the police were riding in. You can see buses and perhaps as many as 100 police officers.
Behind you.
Behind me at this point.
Right.
But you could tell that the mood on the street is like one of celebration. The band is playing, something you would hear maybe during Mardi Gras, and people are dancing and clapping.
Right.
Although there were very crowded at this time, nobody was allowed to leave at this end of the street, and I heard some complaints about that. People were getting frustrated, and were talking about how there were so many police and wondering why they were pressing us and making us turn around, and questioning now what our fate would be, what would actually happen to us, whether all of us would be arrested or just the organizers, the band, or who it was who would be singled out.
Right. So this is when it's starting to dawn on you.
Yes, we were
happening.
pretty certain that we were going to get in trouble.
Right. At this point, did you see policemen above at all? Because I know that
Not yet, but I did in the course of maybe 10 or 12 minutes. I caught video of police stationed in a balcony in one of the apartments that is on the street. Here you can see how the police have lined up on the Union Square side of 16th Street. And now the band is marching on the sidewalk in a column of two.
Right. Now that's permitted under New York
That
City
is permitted under law. However, you're not supposed to block more than half the sidewalk, and all of the audience and the other people, including myself, combined, would, clearly is blocking the sidewalk.
Right.
So,
So at that point, that's kind of out the window at this point.
Yeah.
Because of what the police did.
and also
So
in
there was no
consideration
way
of,
you could comply with the law.
and the fact that they had already broken the law. I mean, they'd clearly done what they had come to do, which was to make their statement by visibly breaking the law and intentionally getting arrested. So the time that you see in the lower right-hand corner is 24-hour time, so this is 7:07 p.m. on Tuesday night. If you notice, the band started at about 2 minutes to 7, so this is almost 10 minutes from the time that the band started. Now, this is an interesting development because you can see 10 minutes after this parade started that there are ranking police officials. The police in the white shirts are the captains, lieutenants, the commanders. They're there in large numbers. Just prior to this, there were shouts that could be heard the word tactical. Can we have tactical? Tactical formation. And this is the police yelling orders to the rank and file officers to get into the formation, which unfortunately my blurry square is covering slightly, but the police are moving into the street right now. And at that point, actually, I had to swap tapes, so you get a 2-minute break. But now you can see an instance of a very physical, almost violent arrest tactic the police were using, which would be to push the protesters onto the ground with the weight of many officers on them. It was remarkable because I believe, from my impression of the scene, it was so unnecessary that, as could be seen in the earlier parts of this video, the crowd was peaceful. I believe this protest had to do with an anti-war sentiment of some kind, but there were no indications that bricks would be thrown through store windows or anything like that. I mean,
Right.
the intention of this was nonviolent political action, aggressive action that would defy the establishment in a particular way in order to get a message across. And what we're seeing in this video, and what will occur actually in a more disturbing way around 7:19 p.m., about 8 minutes from the point that we see in the video here, some very aggressive tactics. Almost, it's hard to look at them and not think that not use the word brutal.
Okay. Well, at this point, I'm not seeing a lot of billy clubs, but yeah.
Well,
okay,
here you
there,
can
yeah, I
see
see a billy club.
that
Right. It's a.
You've cited the billy
right,
club.
My.
So this
square
this formation,
billy club.
this is where you see an altercation happening further down the street. It's about 30 yards down, and I don't have a good view of it from the location I'm at. I situated myself near a bike rack in order to protect myself against the surge that, I figured that because the bike rack was bolted to the concrete of the sidewalk, I'd be fairly safe there. But I did step out just slightly to try to get this altercation. You can see the police motioning us back to the sidewalk. There's a demonstrator who's being taken away. This elderly man in the foreground is just trying to take pictures.
Right.
I'm not sure, I don't remember if he were arrested. But there didn't seem to be any guidelines or rules that were being followed. No one questioned me about my presence on the street. Nobody asked me if I thought I belonged there, whether I was there peacefully or legally there.
Right. The whole tactic was to simply say, everybody who's in the street that we haven't filtered out already within the first couple of minutes, you're all getting swept up in this drag.
Absolutely. That's what happened on the scene that I was a part of. And Charles later can talk about the other demonstrations that were happening in different parts of the city, whether they're consistent with this pattern. But this is a clearly premeditated action by the police.
Right.
That is, they directed the procession onto that street because they were ready at the other end. They had the buses lined up to take us to the detention facility. They had enough numbers that they could overcome some 300 or 400 people which were on the street at the time. So they were well prepared, and personally they caught me by surprise, but it may be that some of the organizers of this event had foreseen this and maybe just didn't make it well known. I'm not sure how much people knew.
Seems very peaceful though. I mean, this amount of people, they're only doing civil disobedience. Okay, but I even remember demonstrations not that long ago which were more violent than this. Why do you think people were that peaceful? I mean, to me they seem peaceful.
I think this was just the intended move that altercation was to be avoided. I found many resources on the internet referring to civil disobedience and the approaches that should be taken. And in every case, I saw ways in which de-escalation of violent behavior can be attempted. That is, if a police officer is being aggressive with you, find ways to talk them out of it, or if you were to encounter other protesters on the street who were spewing invectives or being otherwise confrontational with police, that you should try to calm them down in a particular way, because these types of situations, and we've seen in the past, violence during political protests can be very dangerous, that people can get seriously hurt, especially when you have almost like a mass hysteria situation that can occur with the police entering into the equation. So I think a lot of people were conscious of this, of the possibility that violence could occur, and we're trying to de-escalate it as much as possible.
Right, there's that
you see.
there's that little hint that the police have things pretty tightly under control. They're
Absolutely.
up on the fire escapes as well, so they've got the street cordoned off both ends,
That's right.
and they're going to arrest everybody on the street, and they're going to take them all to jail, and they're going to hold them indefinitely.
Yes, and that was just the beginning of the story.
So de-escalation was successful according to you, or I mean,
Well,
seriously?
I must say that from what I could tell, I didn't see ambulances in the area. I didn't hear stories of people being seriously hurt during this, although in a minute or two you'll see some of the most disturbing incidents of police arrest, of violent arrest, which I can't imagine somebody can walk away without a scratched knee or something affecting them. I don't have firsthand accounts of any injuries that occurred on the street.
I guess it also depends of how badly you want your message out or change. I mean, how important is this so you could actually suffer bruises? But
It's
worth
possible
it,
that some of the
maybe.
protesters were, in this case you can see, most likely, it's hard to see the people they're arresting because there's so many officers that are piling on top of the arrestees. But it's easy to imagine that somebody who is attacked like that would naturally flail their arms or try to defend themselves, try to prevent personal injury to themselves, or if they felt animosity to the police, perhaps even swing a punch or two. But it's hard to, it would be hard to imagine a justification for this type of tactic, this type of really just bullying of people who are otherwise basically just standing on the street. This woman says it, quite clearly. She wants to disperse, and go home. And you could see, almost the fear in her eyes, the panic that was developing in this audience. We were all afraid that this type of treatment would be inflicted on us, and we couldn't see a pattern. In other words, it was scary because it seemed so random that the police would attack protesters, seemingly as if this behavior was justified, and we weren't certain as to what our own fate was. You can hear the crowd chanting, "Peaceful protest, violent cops."
Right, and this was all covered. The tactics of the police that they're using here were covered in a New York Times article quite well, with diagrams showing the police tactics, and that they've learned these tactics from other kinds of protests.
Yes.
That were violent, and right, for the World Economic Forum.
That's what I understand.
Right, and they're applying them here, which is definitely questionable, since these people are they're peaceful, and it's their right to political speech.
But they are exercising civil disobedience.
Yes.
So what would be the appropriate response?
Well, I'm not saying it's an appropriate response. I'm saying I wish this response was actually used to our benefit. But
Charles, you can chime in anytime you like. We have Charles on the line with us.
Right, and hopefully, yes, Charles. Yes, if you want to chime in, and when we get into these kind of topics, go right ahead, because you're on mic.
Are you talking to me there, Rich?
Yes, Charles.
Okay, I could just barely hear you.
Okay.
If you could rephrase the question, that would be helpful.
I don't know. Are you able to hear our conversation very well?
I was only able to pick up a bit of it. So
Okay.
I believe it was Mike recounting a lot of his experience on the sidewalk.
That's right.
Okay. And, well, I mean, where would you like me to start?
Well, we're still watching the tape, but I guess we were under the impression that you were able to follow along with our conversation, and we had just talked about whether comparing the tactics that the police used, that Mike has documented here, that with the tactics that were used in Seattle, say, in the
Right.
right. That's where they learned to do it this way.
Actually, you can chart it back about 3 years earlier than Seattle. The model of security strategy that was rolled out in Seattle was actually developed for the 1996 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Reasons being pretty obvious, it was the first time a Democratic convention had returned to Chicago since 1968.
Yes.
These were tactics that were developed by Bill Clinton. They were not something that was developed by George Bush. They've been around for quite a bit. And they involved massive security containment and deterrence. They involved the rollout of the riot police, the use of tear gas, the use of concussion grenades, mace, pepper spray, sweep nets, and all of these wonderful, wonderful toys that our security establishment has at their disposal these days.
Now, Charles, were you aware of any instances of using, for example, tear gas or pepper spray or any of these other, like that you just mentioned?
In New York City?
In New York?
Yes. On Monday, there were two marches that were billed as poor people's marches. And how ironic that when the poor people come out to complain, the violence starts. But there was an early morning march of the Still We Rise coalition, and that took place on the west side. And then at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in front of the United Nations, there was an international poor persons march that was to go down 2nd Avenue. They started up at the UN, which is in the 50s, and it was a non-permitted march, but it was full of a lot of disabled folks in wheelchairs, old people, people who traveled from all around the world to protest global poverty. And once again, the police said, you'll be fine if you just march down the street, if you don't, or march down the sidewalk, don't obstruct anything, everything will be great. By the time they got to 23rd Street and 2nd Avenue, there were reports, which have been substantiated subsequently, of plainclothes police officers on mopeds driving into the crowds, knocking people into the street in order to arrest them.
Wow.
At one point in time, after a certain police officer had rammed into a certain crowd enough times, one person turned around and slugged him. And the police used this as a kind of entrance to call out the cavalry. And they brought in massive amounts of reinforcement. They tear gassed the crowd. They pepper sprayed a lot of people. They pulled out the orange netting, and they just scooped up anybody inside of it.
Right. So what happened here was minus all that violence, but I don't was the what happened to the people. Where the story goes from here is that now Mike was detained for 43 hours without your Miranda rights?
Without my rights being read to me, without the ability to talk to a lawyer, and clearly without the due process of 24 hours, which is by, I believe, New York statute required.
Yes, that's correct, Mike. Actually, Mike and I were cellmates for a while, and we both spent the bulk of 48 hours locked up. And we did not get to see a judge, and we did not even get to make a phone call until after about 28 hours. And New York statute does dictate that you have to see a judge within 24 hours.
Right. Now, just to finish up on the last topic, were people similarly denied counsel or read their charges in the Seattle instance?
In Seattle, it was a bit of a different circumstance. There weren't as many people as there were in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
I think the maximum amount of people in the street in Seattle was probably about 50,000. And the bulk of the violence, although the mainstream media and now subsequently historical lore has always shown that there was quote-unquote anarchist violence going on there, actually the bulk of the violence was done by the police. And the police were deployed in Seattle to take the protesters, and what isn't reported in the mainstream press is that most of the delegates to developing nations, trade representatives that were supporting some of the poorest nations in the world, were locked out of the conference rooms where decisions about what their nation's trade policies were going to be were being made for them. And so they were standing outside pounding on the doors, and they communicated out to the folks in Indie Media and Democracy Now!, we're not allowed to come in and debate and discuss our own country's trade policies. It was at that point in time when the rally started to get a lot larger, and Seattle called out the riot police and started to clear the street using tear gas, rubber bullets, bean bags, and all of the usual tricks.
Right. But I think that in focusing back on the topic of this particular protest and any comparison between the two, was there a similar detention at the end as a result for the people who were arrested in these other?
Yes, to my understanding, there was detention, and there were also a lot of preemptive arrests made of organizers. They were held in a similar type of pen situation, although, from what I understand, the conditions on that detention center were not as deplorable as those on Pier 57.
Right. So let's. What were the conditions like in Pier 57?
Well, here, let me draw a portrait for you. Pier 57 is about the size of a football field. On the perimeter, in the exterior, it was surrounded by chain link razor wire fence, which was drilled right into the street outside. There was a dual fenced gate through which the transport buses would pull in and deposit prisoners into a long chute where they would be checked in one by one through metal detectors with their arresting officer. Pier 57 had been an old bus depot, and it hadn't been used in about 30 years. There was, understandably, about 30 years worth of oil, transmission fluid, gasoline, antifreeze, chemical solvents on the floor. It was so thick that when you stepped on it, your shoe made an imprint on the floor. There had been a fire there, and there were still remnants of the fire up in the windows. Of course, all of them were sealed, so there was no air flowing through the place. There was asbestos dropping off the ceiling in chunks and clouds. And very quickly it became filled to capacity, beyond capacity, so that whatever temporary bathroom facilities that were there, they were very quickly filled up, and you can only imagine the stench that was coming from the place through that.
How many bathrooms?
There was no room for anybody to lay down or to sit down, so people were forced to go on the floor, which very quickly filled them with, people were coated from head to toe in a black sludge. And after a while, it started creating skin irritation problems and rashes and burns. I've got some myself on both of my forearms. People, their clothes were just caked in this black sludge. The air was stifling. It was really horrible.
Talk about the food.
Well, the food, okay. The bulk of the food that they distributed was a kind of unidentifiable meat product that was
Mystery
probably,
meat.
I'm willing to say a few months past the spoiling date.
It was intended to be bologna at one
in between
point.
two pieces of hard stale bread.
Stale white bread, yeah.
They also distributed a number of cheese sandwiches, and that was about it on Pier 57.
Well, the best food they gave us was apples and oranges. I chose not to eat the oranges because it required, really touching the food, and my hands were covered with this black grit, with grime, oily stuff. Whereas with an apple, you can just grab it at either pull. I liked the fruit, the fact that we were eating some nutritious food, but these stale white bread sandwiches were just deplorable. I couldn't even hold them down. And there wasn't enough water. There was one water cooler for maybe 100, 200 people, and not enough cups.
That's correct.
And the water would keep running out, or people would use the water to wash their hands, so it would be used up faster than you'd expect. And there was just a combination of all those factors: the food, the water, the smell, the lack of sleep. I didn't even want to sit down on this surface. I continued to walk as long as I could until 2 or 3 in the morning, but after a while I had to sit down. I had to lie down and try to sleep.
Well, Mike, you were describing to me that you were, for quite a while when you arrived there, you were bound up still with other people.
One aspect that was particularly humiliating, because while we were in this cage that had razor wire 10 feet up in the air, we had to have these plastic zip tie shackles connecting our hands behind our backs. And there was no reasonable explanation for this. The fact is we were in their custody, and there was no way that we could get out of the cage even if we were unbound. The only way to get those shackles to be removed was to stand in line for an hour or more and wait your turn to use the 4 porta potties.
So there were 4 porta potties for how many people?
I would guess about 500 people at any given time. I was brought into the facility at about 9 o'clock, stayed there until noon the next day, and people were coming in and out. There were bus loads coming from different parts of the city, all of them looking as dazed and confused as we were, but the ones who had been there longer were like shaking their heads like, these people have to go up behind us, so they're going to stay even longer.
Right. Whether men and women were together?
Initially, yes.
So 500 men and women together with 4 porta potties.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, did everybody manage to get to the John when they wanted to, or?
I can only speak
I
for
think
myself.
one has to ask.
But I wasn't aware of any incidents, but it was a deplorable situation. I would have probably, I basically tried to keep to myself and just kind of meditate on my situation and try to get the internal emotional strength to deal with it. And I couldn't pay attention much to the struggles that other people were going through.
Right, and now, in order to get your shackles taken off, you...
Yes, we had to stand in line. Eventually, half the people were free, and half the people had these things, binding their hands behind their backs. Again, it's ridiculous. There was no reason for that situation to occur, and those bindings did bite into my wrists. I had scars for about a week after the detainment.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can speak to that as well. I mean, I have nerve damage in my left hand from these cuffs that they put on us. And they were not very kind about them. And I complained to them that and it was legitimate, I had a shoulder condition which caused my shoulder to come out of the joint every time you pull it behind me. And I had asked them very kindly, you can cuff me, but if you cuff me from the back, you're going to pull my shoulder out. They could have cared less. And it wasn't only until they pulled my arm behind me and it went out of joint that they actually realized that I was going to raise, holy hell about it, and they actually recuffed me in the front.
Right. Now, do you feel like you were treated like a criminal?
We were treated like, I would say criminals got better consideration because when we got to central booking, the criminals were actually whisked through the booking process a lot faster than we were.
Or how long did it take you to be booked?
Well, there was 24 hours where we were on Pier 57, and that was just a containment facility. It was just like all of us being thrown into a pen, and we were overcrowded, and that was when we were all filthy and covered in filth and sick and dealing with all the fumes and the chemicals. I'm almost willing to say that central booking was worse, because there were the same amount of people, but the space that we occupied had been shrunk by about 90%.
That's true. There was
So you
extreme
have
overcrowding.
holding cells that were designed for maybe 10 people, maybe 20 on a busy day, and there were 60 and 70 men stuck into each one of them.
What was the attitude of the cops?
They could have cared less. It was only until about the last 6 hours, and I don't know, I can't say whether or not this was because of information coming down the police chain that said, oh, the Supreme Court's onto this, oh, we might have to let these guys go, oh, there's a lot of complaints, better be nice. But it was only until about the last 6 hours that the police even started expressing any sort of humanity. And it was at that last phase in central booking where some of them actually started approaching us and saying, we feel bad about what's happening to you guys. We agree with what you're doing. We don't think this is right. But for every one that would say that, there was 10 that would scream, get a job, you frickin' dirtbag hippies. Why don't you get the hell out of my city? Open your mouth again and you'll be here to Christmas, so on and so on and so on.
Right.
And I just kind of chalked all of that up to the, general mental and emotional harassment that they were giving us. But I can say genuinely that there were quite a few of them that did not agree with what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to broaden the discussion a little bit because you feel you were treated worse than a criminal, and I think, Mike, you feel the same way.
Absolutely.
How do you now, if you're a political protester exercising your right to protected protest speech, and an activist, are you now a terrorist?
Well, it's interesting.
Well, under the Patriot Act, we can easily be construed as domestic terrorists.
It's interesting.
And, I think that's an important distinction that people need to make. And they need to understand that the legislation that exists within the Patriot Act permits our government to label anyone who dissents against them as domestic terrorists. In fact, there was an argument made that merely by protesting and by engaging in civil disobedience during the week, we were actually engaging in terrorism because we were, quote, making it easier for terrorists to attack us because the police had to divert their attentions elsewhere. I mean, this is kind of fatuous logic that leads to such things as the McCarthyism and the Red Scare and ridiculous political maneuvers that are used to quash any type of dissent or any type of public opinion that doesn't fit in with the agenda of the ruling powers.
Do you feel, Charles, as if this was an intentional attempt by the police to quash political speech, or do you think that they were just following the Patriot Act to the letter, and that they actually did intend to try to control terrorism by sweeping the street of all people?
Well, I think that the New York City Police Department were just doing their job. And I know that that's kind of a, they say, well, the Nazis are just following orders and all this stuff. I don't want to take it that far. I'm really willing to bet that the bulk of the New York City Police Department were just doing what they thought they had to do. I'm utterly convinced that the orders came down from up above. I think it was all Homeland Security and Secret Service and the Republican National Committee that was handing out the orders. And I think that when you start to deal with people on a person-to-person basis, you're dealing with a beat cop who's got a family and who watched 9/11 happen right in front of his face, you start to connect on a very human level. And they don't want to go for this stuff any more than we want to go for it. But when you're dealing with the powers that be in Washington and the larger powers of the FBI and Homeland Security, which have been monitoring activists and infiltrating, nonviolent peace groups and harassing people and preemptively locking them up before they even got to the convention, that's when you start to deal with something a lot more sinister.
Mm-hmm.
So, Sasha, you said...
I have a question, actually, and I have an opinion too, but quickly, because I don't think we have much time, I just wanted to say that, to me, I always look at demonstrations and protests as a goal to something else. It's not a goal per se, right? And somebody who has worked as propagandist and a spin doctor, partially, I have to ask you, Charles, and you, Mike, what do you think this accomplished? I think it was a failure, the protest. Okay. Why? And I think because, first of all, George W. Bush, the idiot, I can say that, I can't vote, has 10% boost after the RNC. You got arrested, the law was broken. Mm-hmm. I don't see any inquiry into that. I don't see masses suddenly waking up to the fact that the country's not as well off as it used to be. So what did the protest accomplish?
Well, it's possible that
that's a good point. And, if I may, mm-hmm. I think I agree with you in that techniques of protest that had been used for previous generations are proving their obsolescence now. I think that's fairly clear. But on the other hand, I think that the fact that there are 2,000 people arrested in a day, that there are people willing to go to the lengths that some of us who actually, Mike's in a very different position than I was. Mike was a legitimate victim. He was somebody that was just trying to stand there and record the incident or witness it but he wasn't a participant. I was somebody who actually consciously participated in a die-in. And I attribute most of what you're saying to the absolute irresponsibility and lack of coverage on part of the mainstream media. If you hearken back to 1968, what turned the tide in 68 was that Daley decided to sic his police force on the hippies. And when he did so, the police indiscriminately cracked skulls towards anyone they could find. They made the big mistake of attacking the press. And the next day, in all the major papers, in all the syndicated news wires, was Daley attacks press, Daley attacks people indiscriminately. And once the mainstream media turned against the establishment, which was represented by Daley, when he said, you know, this is Chicago, this is America, and they said, oh, well, you know, if this is America, then what are you doing, you know, beating up our kids? And here was a number of teenage and young, you know, children in their 20s calling their parents saying the Chicago police have attacked us, and then all of this makes it into the papers the next day, and then Walter Cronkite talks about it on the news the next day. That swung the tide. Well, what we have today is a media that is completely an arm and an extension of the political apparatus.
Well, let me ask you, you and Mike both now, or all of you, is protest now particularly a liberal form of speech? Is you know, if you march in a parade and chant, is that basically a liberal tactic? Do conservatives?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, some of the most violent and some of the most energetic protests are the pro-lifers on the very conservative side. When I was in Boston for the Democratic National Convention, there was a contingent of pro-lifers that were driving around huge vans that had these 6-foot-high photocopies of mutilated fetuses from abortions on them.
I saw those too.
And huge contingencies of people that were following behind them, condemning the Democrats for being, you know, decadent and for killing unborn human beings.
So Charles,
I would definitely say it's not a liberal thing.
I'm wondering
I think
if
the protest is protest. It's an extension of democracy, but what's happening now is that the protest itself, particularly the liberal end of the protest, is being marginalized. It's being mocked. It's being belittled.
Have you, Charles, have you ever seen instances of right-wing protests being dealt with in the same way that the liberal protests are being dealt with, particularly in New York?
Say that again?
Well, the instances of the pro-life movement and other conservative protests, do you see police crack down on those groups the way you saw with the liberal protesters in New York?
You saw a lot more of it in the 90s when the pro-life movement got violent and started bombing clinics.
Yes.
And there was quite a bit of police reprisal against that. And there was quite a bit of the security establishment rolled out to protect abortion doctors and clinic workers and so on and so forth.
Understandably.
So yeah, I think it is relevant and it is relative, and I think it is reflected by who's ever in power. So what we have now is a very conservative establishment, and so what they're going to do is demonize the liberal or progressive elements. If you have the other element in power, they're going to demonize the other side. Ultimately, what it all boils down to is that we live in a country that is completely divided in half, and half the country does not want to hear what the other half has to say. But until we start listening to each other, until we start sitting down and talking to each other as people, respectfully, peacefully, then we're not going to get anywhere, and we're certainly not going to solve any of this, and we're certainly not going to recognize that it's all of us against the power establishment, and that they're only creating this arbitrary division between us. We're all working people. We're all poor. We're all trying to just get by. And these folks up here, whether they're John Kerry or whether they're George Bush, they're all trying to pull something on an entirely different level than what we, as normal Americans, are accustomed to.
Right. Well, nicely said. I just have a couple of elements of housekeeping, so to speak, for the show before we go off the air, and that is Mike's account of his arrest and his containment can be found out on his website at www.mikehallvideo.com. SCATV.com. And Charles, your story appears on a newtopiamagazine.net. It's the current feature story, so if you just go to that address, you will see a link for Guantanamo on the Hudson, and you'll get to read Charles's story. Mike, is there anything you want to say in closing?
I think that not only up to the election, but after the election, that as many people as possible who feel strongly about these issues should speak out about them, do research about them, and not to feel intimidated when they go out to the streets. That our freedom of speech is irrevocable, and the Bill of Rights allows these freedoms, and we should take advantage of them to the utmost in order to fight against these forces.
Mm-hmm. Savich?
Whoever wins, John Kerry or George W. Bush, please struggle against the corporate media.
Charles, you have any closing words? We just have a few seconds left.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody that the American Constitution is one of the finest documents that's ever been written, and there are some less than honorable people that are trying to use it to justify ends that are not in the spirit of our Constitution. And whether you're a Republican who lives in Kansas City or whether you're a liberal who lives in New York City, if your job is outsourced to China, who's making the money and who isn't?
Okay, well, I think that's about all we have time for, and I'd like to thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
And good luck with getting your story heard. And thank you for watching Dead Air Live.
Thanks a lot, Rich. Appreciate that.
Thank you.